So the next panel, we had discussions about near Arctic states. We've had discussions about observing nations, the 8 Arctic nations, and the different tiers of observers. And something caught the attention of me and many others during some of these discussions today, but also in the past, which is we should probably hear from some of those non-Arctic nations that have an investment and an interest in the Arctic. So I'm very happy to have here colleagues from Japan to suss out for us Japan's Arctic interests writ large. So I'm happy to introduce to the stage Dr. Atsushi Sunami, the president of the Ocean Policy Research Institute and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and his colleagues from Japan that he will introduce. Dr. Sunami.
Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you, Mike. First of all, I'm very delighted, honored to be here with you. I'd like to thank the Wilson Center for giving us this great opportunity to introduce you some of our recent work in Japan, particularly on our Arctic policy. And here with me, my colleagues from my institute, the retired Rear Admiral Mr. Akimoto, who is responsible for our national security program, and our Vice President, Eiji Sakai, who is responsible for our Arctic program in our institute. And myself as the President of the Ocean Policy Research Institute and Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And I have given 20 minutes, actually, to introduce the Japan's Arctic policy, as well as hopefully to have some time to invite some of the questions from you, from floor, 1 or 2 maybe, given the remaining of the time. So let's see. Does this work? Okay, let me see. Oh, maybe working. Maybe not. Point it up. Oh. Well, that's. I guess my PhD from Columbia, it's not working. The American education is not. Okay. All right. Anyway, just a brief introduction of the Ocean Policy Research Institute in Japan. We are the nonprofit, independent policy research institute in Tokyo, and we are the kind of unique institution because probably we are the only one that dedicated our research on the Arctic, the ocean policy research. And we have been working very closely with the Japanese government on any issues that relate to the ocean. More recently, we worked with our government on the hosting of G20 summit in Osaka, where we work closely on the developing our G20 Osaka Blue Ocean Initiative, especially on the issues of marine plastics. But also, Japan actually launched our first Arctic policy in 2015, and we worked very closely on that as well, especially some of the priority areas of Japan's Arctic policy, particularly centering around the Arctic science and also international collaboration. And of course, looking at the opportunity for Northern Sea Route that been discussed previously in our previous panel. At the moment, it's been about four years since we launched the Arctic policy, and now we are talking about reviewing the policy. And see how much we have progressed along those first our policy, and then in looking at the what we can do as a next phase of accelerating our Arctic policy from 2020. And some of it, of course, has to do with a lot of the changes that are going on surrounding the Arctic. And one of which is really about how we can enhance our cooperation with the United States in the Arctic. And this is one of the reasons why we have been discussing very closely with Mike Wilson Center and their program here on the Arctic, where we can see whether we can work together on developing some of the issues that are important for U.S. Japan in the Arctic in coming years. Of course, here's the slides that are coming. So let me try to briefly, yeah, there you go. Let's see. I'll skip all that because I already said this. Okay, so this was the Japan's Arctic policy, which we launched in 2015. At the time, I was serving as a special advisor in the cabinet office for the minister in charge of the ocean and science and technology. And I remember rolling out this policy for the first time, where we have the being observer state and near Arctic state, but we didn't have a comprehensive policy on what we should be doing in Arctic. And of course, Japan has been working very closely with the United States in science in Arctic. If you remember, our first cooperation was symbolic cooperation. I think the Hayo was here earlier, I guess, mentioning about some of the scientific activities in IARC in the Fairbanks, Alaska, University of Alaska. And when you visit there, you see the Japanese flag along with the U.S. flag on the center, because if I remember correctly, it was back in 1997, former Prime Minister Hashimoto visited Washington and had a meeting with President Clinton back then, where they signed agreement on the common agenda to look at the Arctic research as one of the main important issue for U.S.-Japan cooperation in the looking at more larger common agenda. And as a result of that, we have worked closely with the U.S. and University of Alaska to establish that center there in Arctic. And I think it's been a little bit more than 20 years. We just actually celebrated 20 years of establishment in Fairbanks recently with the University of Alaska and the Wilson Center and ourselves. So it's been a very important source of cooperation in science. And so you can see in the Japan's Arctic policy, the first element is research and development. And of course, we wanted to accelerate this cooperation in understanding the status of the Arctic and cooperate in terms of monitoring and assessing, as well as training and data sharing and all that things that have been listed there. And of course, we wanted to highlight more to engage in Japan's Arctic policy with the international cooperation. And so this is a kind of sort of the main elements of the Arctic policy we rolled out in 2015. So after being 4 years, that we are now talking about reassessing what we have been doing, looking and then see whether we need to revise some of the Japan's Arctic policy in light of today's current situation and environment. And as a result of the first Arctic policy, we have created what we call ARCS program, which is the Japan's comprehensive platform for promoting Arctic research for Japan. And now that's a 5-year plan program, and by 2020 we have to go to the next phase of our Arctic research platform. And well, as we discuss the next phase of the ARCS program, of course, can we find more way of collaborating with the United States on the Arctic science collaboration. And as Hayo mentioned, that in 2020, Japan will be co-hosting the Arctic Science Ministerial Meeting along with the Iceland. And by about a year and a half ago, our Ocean Policy Research Institute hosted the Arctic Seminar International Conference in Japan, where we invited the former president of Iceland, President Grimson, for the first time to Japan. And at that time, the idea came up that the Iceland and Japan possibly co-host the what we call AMS3, which is Arctic Science Ministerial Meeting in Japan. And I remember visiting Washington back in 2016 with the minister at the White House. And at that time, Dr. Holdren, in the White House, told us about the first Arctic Science Ministerial meeting hosted here in Washington. And we got the invitation from him to come and participate as an observer state, but important science research program that we had, so that we can share some of our work in the Arctic research. And now I remember now that we are now hosting that in 2020, so it will be a great opportunity for us to talk about the re-strengthening of our U.S.-Japan Arctic science collaboration at that time. So we'll be talking about that, how we're going to do that in there. There is also another issue of more utilization of Arctic sea route. Now at the moment we are talking about building actually a new, for the first time, the icebreaker in Japan for scientific research. And this is something that at the moment we're talking with the Japanese government on the plan to build the new icebreaker for the launch in 2020, the Arctic Science Ministerial in Japan, and see whether we can have some more progress in this idea. But also at the same time, we wanted to make sure that there is some business community that are interested in the Arctic, where we'll be talking a lot with the, particularly in the Hokkaido prefecture, which is our most northern part of Japan, and their interest there, that they have shown some keen interest in the utilization of the Arctic sea route there. So that's another point. And lastly, we are now talking about more active engagement of member of parliaments in Japan, where they're interested in the Arctic policy, and perhaps we'll be helping them to promote to establish some kind of parliamentary discourse, particularly in Washington here in coming years, with the Japanese member parliaments coming and have more exchange here with the U.S. Japan to find out more on the policy arena, where we can find more concrete some of the advancing of the U.S. Japan cooperation in the Arctic. OPRI and myself are actually hosting the caucus in Japan on the for the members' parliaments on the Arctic issue, and so that we can work together with the perhaps the Wilson Center to create a sort of the vision for the U.S.-Japan cooperation in the Arctic, so that this parliamentary exchange can actually work on that platform in the coming year or so. So anyway, let's see, I have spent more than almost 15 minutes. So I would invite maybe a few comments from my colleagues here before I invite a few questions from the floor. So perhaps Akimoto-san, you wanted to say a few things about from the national security perspective, because you have.
Thank you, President. And as I retired JMSDF almost 19 years ago in the World Navy, so I have few information about the official standpoint strategy or policy plan of Japan Defense Ministry. But in general speaking, the Japanese security concern, security interest in Arctic is the stabilized security environment and securing sea route. So personally, I think not only the Arctic Council member state, but also the nations concerned in Arctic security should consider more about how to ensuring the way of safety of navigation, freedom of navigation, and the applicable search and rescue system, or the rule-based marine resource development, or so forth. This is my idea. Thank you very much. And
Okay, so Sakai-san, you wanted to say something about value tree analysis that we've worked, but also maybe Hokkaido's prefecture with the project that we're doing.
Thank you. I just want to a little talk about the value tree analysis that Hayo mentioned in this morning. Actually, I think the value tree analysis is a very effective way to visualize the value of the Japan's Arctic scientific observation activities. And it gives some very good information to Japanese policymakers to evaluate what we did so far on the Arctic, and also to make priorities what we should do from now under the new Arctic policy. And I think this is a very important process for Japan to share what Japan is going to do on the Arctic from now. And I think this is very good information, not only for Japan, but also to the international communities, and as well as the taxpayer in Japan. And now our colleagues just started the study on the analysis work, and I hope that we can share the outcome of the analysis data at the Arctic Circle Japan Forum in November next year. Actually, I just want to mention about the Arctic Circle Japan Forum. As Mr. Sunami mentioned, we have a very close relationship with Arctic Circle Secretariat, and now we are planning to hold the Japan Forum in coupling with the Science Ministerial. I think this maybe the end of November next year. So we're going to hold a big conference, and we are very welcome to all of you to Tokyo. And yeah, actually that would be very supportive event to the Arctic Science Ministerial.
Thank you. Yes. So, Mike, should we have one or two? Yeah. Right. Okay. So, yes, Taro.
Yes, thank you very much for a great review of what's happening in Japan in terms of the policy. We had the Arctic event in Hokkaido last summer, so I would like to thank all of you for the collaboration for the Arctic Economic Council for the third Top of the World Broadband Summit, where the first one was held in Barrow 3 years ago. My question is considering the Arctic work of different Asian countries, namely China, South Korea, and Japan. And as you're aware, there is a collaboration agreement between these three nations in terms of the Arctic issues. So I would love to hear a few words about your insights of that agreement and how it will be developed in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Should I answer that? Okay. Yes, we do have a collaboration between the Korea and China, three countries on the Arctic policy, and we meet every year to talk at the government level, to have an exchange of what our views and what our engagement in Arctic. And especially recently, there's aside from three-country talk, we had also the China hosted the Arctic Circle in Shanghai, where we had jointly worked with the Chinese counterpart of our institute to co-host the seminar to talk about China-Japan cooperation in Arctic. And most of at the moment, I think it's a lot to do with the research cooperation, where how much can our scientific activities in the region can cooperate together, and of course, Korea and China actively engaged in investing on the Arctic science as well. So is there any way we can collaborate on that front? We also talk about sort of the possibility of Northern Sea Route and how that affect our logistics. But that business sector side of discussion is still relatively less developed compared to science and policy sharing at the moment. But I think when the opportunity is more open up for the Asian countries to actually get in economic interest, direct economic interest, and through the Northern Sea Route, I think then we'll be talking a lot in terms of both business communities. But we have already some collaboration or this discussion on Yamao project with China and Japan and the business sector, and so there is a ground for that. So, but at the moment, for three countries, will be mainly the scientific cooperation at the beginning. Yes.
So Lawson, maybe just another quick question before we move to the next
Yes,
panel.
thank you for coming to the conference. You did use the magic words near Arctic country, and before you got here, those terms were used in a negative context towards China. So could you give us kind of a global view of what you mean by near Arctic and Japan's interests? Put you on the spot here a little bit, but.
Yes, thank you for that question. Actually, we obviously, maybe Mr. Akimoto also mentioned that there is some discussions about more the recent geopolitical change in the Arctic, where we sort of first discussed about our Arctic policy 2015. We remain as sort of a humble observer state, and I think that status hasn't changed for Japan. But of course, we are aware of the China and Korea and their active, engagement in the Arctic, which sort of gives us some kind of sense of a little bit of urgency of what we should be. Should we accelerate our activities? That's the one reason why, at the moment, we are talking about reviewing our Arctic policy and see whether if there's any change or in the discourse where we engage in the Arctic policy. And I think we're not going to be, I wouldn't say directly competing with China in the Arctic, but I think we are trying to promote more cooperation with countries like the United States or our general natural allies in a more global perspective. And so I think this is something that for next phase of our Arctic policy, what can we sort of really put in as in U.S.-Japan cooperation in Arctic. That is something new. So,
good. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please thank this wonderful panel. Dr. Sunami, thank you for coming, and thank you to your colleagues as well. Very fruitful discussion. Appreciate it very much. So we've heard throughout the day and a half a lot of discussions about China. So we thought that we would impose upon our friend and colleague, Dr. Nong Hong, to speak a little bit about her work and her research on China in the Arctic. So please, Dr. Hong, come on out. Dr. Hong is the Executive Director and Senior Fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Her interdisciplinary research includes ocean governance in East Asia and the Arctic, the law of the sea, and international security. Dr. Hong.
Thank you, Dr. Spraga, for having me here today. I apologize I wasn't able to be here yesterday because I arrived in the Reagan Airport at 10 a.m. this morning. If I say anything wrong, it's about the jet lag, not about myself. And I was asked to share with you the views about what is China's policy on the Arctic, because I wasn't sure how much has been discussed through yesterday and also the first half of this morning discussion about China's role. So I apologize in advance if my following remarks have been adjusted by the previous sections yesterday. There are many ways to look at There are many ways to review Chinese policy or engagement in the Arctic governance or the participation in many of its Arctic activities regions. So I would like to categorize activity because China is a non-Arctic state, so it's observing what's happening in Arctic governance. On the other hand, its activity and its policy also be observed. So I'm going to look at Chinese policy from the following way. I'm going to talk a little bit about China's role and its engagement with a variety of international institutions, and what is the international framework for China's participation in these regions. And then I'm also going to discuss a little bit what is China's partnership with the Arctic stakeholders, including the Arctic littoral states and also other 3 Arctic Council states. And I'm going to also talk a little bit about its partnership with indigenous people and also non-Arctic regions like Japan and South Korea. And in order to also understand Chinese activity in the Arctic, and I try to also to look at Chinese activity in a different sectoral engagement, which means shipping and resource development or scientific research. And then I'm going to follow on about a few discussions about the current discourse on, for instance, the polar Silk Road and debt trap in a negative way, and also China's science diplomacy, and also to talk a little bit about the opportunities and challenges for Arctic states. So from 2008, China has officially expressed interest becoming observing Arctic Council. It took China 5 years to get this status in 2013, together with Japan, South Korea, Singapore, India, in Asia. So, and then in 2018, January, another 5 years, and China came up with its first Arctic policy white paper. So it took more longer than Japan and South Korea, who are very quickly to develop the Arctic policy. So after a very careful consideration, China published its first policy paper in 2018. So in this very short Arctic paper, it talks about the policy and it talks about environment protection and talk about resource development and talk about international cooperations. So in order to understand, I think it mentioned about the 4 keywords, which is to understand, to protect, to develop, and participate in the governance of Arctic. So in order to realize the policy, it also emphasized the 4 key principles, which is to respect, to cooperate, and win-win result and sustainability. So this Arctic white paper received different reactions from the coastal states and also from other international communities. And some are welcoming with very positive comments, and some with suspicious, especially from some littoral states. To talk about China's engagement in international institutions, I'm going to raise a few examples. For instance, in terms of governance, it became the observing the Arctic Council. And then in terms of shipping, it actually participated in the formulation of IMO's protocol in January 2017. So on the fishery issues, and it's also involved in the recent adoption of agreement to prevent unregulated high sea fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean. On science, there has been pursued very active international cooperation on Arctic science research. One of the examples is it joined International Arctic Science in 1996. And then to look at Chinese understanding on international law framework, China is a party to the Svalbard Treaty, which it ratified in 1925, and also a party to UNCLOS, which governs the Arctic regimes in this region. And it also a party member to many of the UN special agreements like IMO and many of the treaties that China is a party to, and it also ratified many of the UN-based regime fighting against climate change and many international environmental treaties. And then moving on to its bilateral relations with many of the stakeholders, it's very important to differentiate, for instance, many of the three key like North American countries, also Russia. Russia and Canada, its attitude towards China's policy in the Arctic, it changed from time to time. I remember during the period that China is fighting for the observer status, and Russia and Canada are the countries who are more concerned about China's increasing activity in this region. But now that I think probably you hear from yesterday, there was a lot of discussion on the increasing bilateral cooperation between China and Russia. In terms of role of the United States, I think we see a lot of, I think the US is changing its policy toward China's participation in this region. Before 2013, I don't see a lot of objection from the US government in terms of like Chinese fighting, working together, observer state, the Arctic Council. But recently with the US Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, making a lot of comments in different occasions, highlighting increasing cooperation between China and Russia. So obviously, I personally believe that the United States taking, involving or changing policy on Chinese role. For other countries like Iceland and also Denmark, Norway, Sweden and Finland in the Arctic Council, I think they are more welcoming Chinese participation in Arctic investment, but on the other hand, they also hold careful, prudence attitude towards China's participation, especially on the resource development. In terms of a trilateral cooperation, I believe we hear a lot from our Japanese colleague. There was a lot of discussion, cooperation between China, Japan, and South Korea. The three East Asian countries, they share very similar interests. And it's very interesting to know that they have more, they meet every year with the senior official for MFA, the trilateral Arctic meeting, and also there are discussion or cooperation in terms of Arctic scientific research. So I mentioned about the three sectoral engagement for China. One is for shipping, and so the shortened distance through either the Northwest Passage and Northern Sea Route actually provide a lot of opportunity for China's maritime industry. And this few slides just to show how important that maritime transportation is for China. So the world container port volume, Asia countries occupy 64%. And for the top 20 port terminals, and China actually owns 7 of them. And this slide shows that on the 10 global terminals, and China also owns 7 or 8. And this slide shows you that the world's leading ports by productivity. So there are many opportunities for China's maritime transport industries. And as we hear from the previous panel, that because of piracy and increasing insurance for the ship traveling via the Gulf of Aden, so the alternative shipping trans-Arctic routes will certainly serve lowering the risk of sailing through the piracy affected region. And then also, China is eager to diversify its supply and trade routes, particularly by reducing its reliance on shipping routes through the Strait of Malacca and also Columbus Strait. Certainly, there are also environmental economic benefits from using fewer larger vessels over a shortened distance. And opportunity always comes with challenges. So I would like to talk a little bit about this legal challenge in addition to political, economic, safety challenge and environment challenges. In terms of legal challenges, we hear about the Northwest Passage from Canada and Northern Sea Route for Russia. Obviously, and the U.S. and European Union took a very different views than Russia and also Canada in terms of legal state of these two important routes. For China, it has not mentioned very clearly in its white paper what is standpoint on how it view what is internal water use for straight use for internal navigation, or it agree with Russian or Canada view as internal water. So there's no provisions in this white paper. However, it does mention that all the activities to explore or utilize an Arctic will abide by international law, especially the law of the convention, also should respect the domestic regulation and law by the coastal states. So in the future, we're not very sure what kind of approach that China or approach that Russia or Canada will take in order to, for instance, for countries like China, Japan, and South Korea, where they're going to take this Canadian approach with United States agree to disagree, and using its 1988 Arctic cooperation. So you agree that for the U.S., then you have to get permission for Canadian authority, but on the other hand, it's not going to affect your political or legal position, or for the Russia's practices, whether we're going to have a bilateral arrangement between China and Russia or between Japan or Russia, it's remained to be seen. So there's a lot of legal challenge in ahead. If the shipping through the Northwest Passage become a reality in the future, we see a lot of ongoing shipping activity through the Northern Sea Route, but not too much on the Northwest Passage. And the other sector is resource development. I think I'm not here yesterday, but I hear from other occasions there are a lot of discussion. It's about Chinese increasing activity in resource development in the Arctic. But I have to say that it depends on which area we are talking about. So in terms of resource development, we're talking about either the areas beyond national jurisdiction or by area defined by the law of the convention. Because the 5 little Arctic states, Canada, Russia, and Norway, Denmark, and also United States, only Russia and then I believe Norway received recommendation from the Commission of Outer Limit of Canadian Shelf. So, and U.S. is not a party to law of the convention, and Denmark and Canada has not received formal recommendation. So we're not very sure where are the areas that China would be able to participate in the mineral resource development in the area, which belongs to humankind. And then where are the areas that beyond the jurisdiction of these little states? So Chinese future activity or ongoing activity have to depend on how it engage and how it cooperate with the little state in the Arctic, like Russia, Canada, Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden. So there are many different reaction or different type of activity ongoing. I believe the discussion with Russia, and we hear quite often also for Myanmar as well. Japan also had discussion with China how to increase its cooperation with Russia, and also in Iceland as well, and Norway. There's some ongoing discussion, negotiation on resource development. And there are certainly some challenges as well in terms of political challenges, because we are actually having unresolved boundary limitation among the Arctic states. We don't know where are the area between which country's national jurisdiction, and there are on the overlapping area when a foreign country have to be engaged in, who it has to talk to. And there was also non-Arctic states interests like Japan, China, South Korea. They all have similar interests in resource development, and they might have interesting phenomenon of competition among themselves as well. So in terms of economic challenges, it's easy to talk about how much profit that country may benefit from the resource development, but we cannot actually underscore the economic challenge, such as there's a difficult and expensive in terms of harsh weather and limited transportation access, as well as the long supply lines, which are very practical issues here. So in the white paper, China does mention that all the activity and resource development has to be bound by international law, and particularly have to respect the national interests of the coastal states and also the national regulation of the coastal states. I think that's very important to bear in mind that when we talk about Chinese interest in resource development, and then we should also keep in mind the principle highlighted in China's white paper, which is on the one hand, you have to respect the regulation governed by international law. On the other hand, it's very important, you have to respect the national interests of littoral states in order to be a welcoming partnership in these regions. And the third sector is interest in the polar research. And China has been developing many bilateral research cooperation with many of the littoral states, especially the Nordic countries. There is China Nordic Arctic Research Center, which involved many of the leading research institutions in China, also in Norway, Denmark, Finland. The headquarters is based in Shanghai. I believe all these leading research institutions meet very frequently, exchanging views on how to conduct Arctic research or scientific cooperation. Then the challenges facing China in order to understand its policy in the Arctic, we often hear many debate on whether, because the policy rule was included in the language in the white paper, and there is a lot of discussion, what is China's interest, what is China's strategic goal in using the policy rule in the Arctic. So I believe there are always negative and also positive comment as well. And the other term that we often hear is about the debt trap, where a lot of people are talking about China investment in Africa and investment in Latin America as a debt trap. Now they're using this term to describe China's investment in Arctic as well. So for China to realize its mission, which it described in its Arctic policy white paper, to become a responsible and international stakeholder, it's very important to clear away the obstacle or dilemma coming along with international discourse, such as the policy rule and debt trap. And in the future, although China has interest in developing shipping through the Arctic routes and also has interest in resource development with the Arctic states, but in the future, I think science, technology development or Arctic research on climate change, environmental protection, going to play a leading role in guiding China's policy in Arctic regions. So I want to make a point that the white paper, it's the first time China actually issued a white paper in terms of the ocean, and it integrates Chinese narrative into Western discourse, defining itself as an important stakeholder. So this narration has won recognition and respect from the international community and also from the littoral states. And then I want to raise a question because it's very interesting when I hear a lot of discussion especially lately about the increasing China-Russia cooperation. So very often the United States highlighting increasing cooperation between Russia and China and describing as a new security threat. And so we are facing a question whether we are actually in a new paradigm of competition, or we're also seeing potential cooperation among the three. So currently we have bilateral cooperation between United States and Russia, Russia and China, also Russia and United States. So whether we're going to see this paradigm followed by the American narration, which means that we're seeing the U.S., the China-Russia cooperation as a threat, or we can actually to see opportunity for trilateral cooperation, especially when we have this fishery agreement in the Central Arctic Ocean. So that's a very interesting question I had. My last slide, and I think for observing countries like China, Japan, and South Korea, and we have interest and we deem ourselves as non-Arctic states. And we have to recognize, it's very important to recognize that becoming observer in the Arctic Council, you have to respect the sovereign right and the sovereignty of the littoral states. So that's very clear. So then those observing states, they also have the legitimate interest in this region. So recognizing, respecting each other's interests will constitute the legal basis for cooperation between the Arctic and non-Arctic states. And the second point is the mutual understanding and trust provide political guarantee for cooperation between the Arctic and non-Arctic states. So there are a lot of areas that which a single country or a regional group might not be able to achieve, especially in terms of scientific research, and you actually need cooperation no matter you are littoral states or coast states or non-Arctic states. And my last point is about the peace, stability, and sustainable development of Arctic region represent the shared objective of cooperation between Arctic and non-Arctic states. So I think with that, finish my presentation. If you have any question, I don't have a moderator, please.
I think we'll just take a break. Just stay here for a moment. So thank you for thanking Dr. Hong for that. What I think I'd like to do, and by the way, thank you for flying all the way here, getting off at 10 a.m. this morning from the plane, and then coming to speak with us today on this very important issue. So thank you. I also think it's very good to bring other voices in and different perspectives in, so really appreciate that. What I'd like to do is have a 10-minute break, and maybe we can impose upon you. Maybe we'll stand outside for some questions, and then use the foyer to have some additional questions as well during the other period. Great. So a 10-minute break. We'll start back here at 3 o'clock, and the next panel is on Arctic science, and after that, 2 panels on security. The Arctic science panel will be moderated by Dr. John Farrell, so you know that he will be on time and on point. Thank you.